Good evening and welcome to the National Gallery for the Acre Award of the Edmund Burke Prize 2016. I can see that it's a mixed audience, that there are Remainers and Leavers, there are people from all over Europe, so let me make an uncontroversial, I hope, point that will unite all of us, whichever side we were on. After Britain has left the European Union, we will no longer have to apply a tariff on the excellent Australian wine we've just been drinking. It will all become tariff-free. It's wonderful to have the Australian High Commissioner Alexander Downer here, and it's wonderful to have the chairman of the Conservative Party, Patrick McLaughlin, and so many other distinguished peers, MPs, and other friends in this beautiful room, in this gorgeous gallery. I'm glad to say the National Gallery, in common with a number of English galleries, but very unusually by European standards, began as a private collection. It wasn't a state initiative, it was an organic and natural private initiative. And I've always particularly liked this room, the Spanish gallery, these wonderful examples of Counter-Reformation art. If you spend any time in this room, you'll see that the crowds gather particularly in front of that picture there. It's called the Rokeby Venus by Velázquez. And it's they're attracted obviously by the tenderness, the sensuality of it. It's an unusual picture for its time. It was painted in the late 1640s when very few Spanish artists painted nudes. It was the time of the Spanish Inquisition and so on. But it's a piece with a history because almost exactly 100 years ago, it was attacked by a violent suffragette called Mary Richardson, who said she didn't like the way men looked at it. And of course, it's still the way that people of both sexes look at it, as I've just explained. But what's fascinating is what happened next. Mary Richardson, people forget the next chapter of the story, went on to become a member of Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. And I think in the story of the attack on the Rokeby Venus, we see an elemental truth of conservatism. See, other ideologies, whether socialism or fascism, are very often based on discontent, on a sense of grievance and anger at the world. But it would be as unthinkable for a conservative to take a butcher's cleaver to an old master, or to a painting by an old master, as it would be to deface a constitution. Because conservatism is rooted not in grievance, but in love. Love for our heritage, for our institutions, for our laws, for our families, and for our nations. And that's why it's such a great occasion to bring together from around Europe, and particularly from this part of the world, people to celebrate that ideology. And it takes its origin. The man who taught us to love in this sense was the original patriarch of conservatism, Edmund Burke. It was he who proclaimed the superiority of the natural, the evolved, the organic, over the planned, the rationalist, the imposed. It's very appropriate that we should name our prize after the first and greatest conservative. I can remember when I was 19 years old, the end of my first undergraduate summer, reading Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution on a Greyhound bus in the US. And I can remember coming across a passage where, en passant, he talks about the French king being made prisoner. And I remember putting the book down and staring open-mouthed at my fellow passengers, because it was only at that moment that it properly hit me that Burke's Reflections, the greatest screed against arbitrary government and revolution ever composed, was entirely written, as it were, in the future tense. He'd completed it before the terror began. It was the most extraordinary act of prophecy. And that, in a way, was the story of Burke as a writer. Always the seer, the Irish Vate, able to descry a future invisible to his contemporaries. He was right about America, he was right about India, he was right about Ireland, he was right outstandingly about the French Revolution, and of course his contemporaries never properly forgave him. But he stands now as the founder of the ideology that has done most to lift our species to health and wealth. I can't think of a better recipient for a prize named after the founder of conservatism than John Howard, who will be receiving our award. And I can't think of a better person to present it than the great Irishman's biographer, Jessie Norman. John describes himself as a Burkean. In a very nice phrase, John said, "My party is the party of Burke and Mill," which kind of all you need to know about the Australian Liberals, right? I mean, the perfect elemental Platonic ideal of a party, the party of Burke and Mill. John's Burkeanism was overt and implicit, particularly when he led the campaign against the move to a republic in Australia. He used very explicit Burkean arguments about preferring the wisdom of our ancestors, not reinventing the wheel, going with the prejudice of what has worked before, rather than a theoretically potentially superior, but in practice untried scheme. John was not only a great Burkean, but was a great Anglospherist and the greatest friend to this country in the time that he was Prime Minister. The thing that a lot of people don't know about John Howard is that John's middle name is Winston. Now, you might think, well, nothing unusual there. There are lots of people born in the 1940s who were called Winston. John was born in the summer of 1939, when Neville Chamberlain was still Prime Minister and the war hadn't started yet. There was a real affirmation of faith. From a family that had a great distinction. Both John's father and his grandfather had served in the First World War, on one occasion, bizarrely by coincidence, bumping into each other in a small French village. And in times when the Anglosphere didn't always have great leadership, the community of free, democratic, English-speaking nations could always look to John. I think it's fair to say he is the most successful Conservative leader of my lifetime. Ronald Reagan won 2 great elections. Margaret Thatcher won 3. He won 4. Governed Australia for nearly 12 years. I don't think any of his successors has managed 12 weeks consecutively without being ousted by some internal coup in one party or the other. But much more than that, he used his time in office to effect a benign and permanent transformation of that great country. Expansive, generous, and honest, he is the embodiment of that great red landmass. I realize that I'm talking to an audience largely made up of politicians. And I think perhaps the practitioners of representative politics will understand, in a way that civilians will never really understand, how rare is the politician who truly uses office for purpose. We know, in a way that very few observers can ever really know, how easy it is to have a perfectly successful career by positioning yourself correctly, by voting the right way, by saying the right things, by having an irreproachable record, but by making only the merest dent in the world around you. And John Howard was not such a man. The Australia that he left behind had enjoyed a higher rate of growth than at any time since the peak of the gold rush. And that didn't just happen on its own. It happened because he was prepared to make the changes in labor law, in nationalized companies being privatized, in paying back the debt, in negotiating the trade agreements across Asia. That is my kind of conservative. And I'll tell you someone else who's my kind of conservative. The Don, the city whiz kid, the long-serving MP and writer, and now minister, Jessie Norman, who has written the most brilliant biography of Edmund Burke, but who has applied Burkean principles not only to his philosophy. He's written the most gorgeous works about how to re-inject a sense of ownership and propriety into the free market system, but also into his own career. Burke, I said, was never forgiven by his contemporaries for the high-minded way in which he'd got everything right. He served only very briefly as a minister before resigning fairly typically on a minor point of principle. Jessie had his own, maybe not minor, but his own points of principle, first on preservation of the House of Lords, where Edmund Burke's ghost would have been applauding, rattling its chains in enthusiasm, and then over the Syrian intervention. And yet, Howard-like, he turns out to be one of those Burkeans who's now in a position to make a difference and has achieved ministerial office. And so, in their way, they are both wonderful examples to the rest of us of how it's possible to use power to put principles to purpose. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are awarding a prize named after the patriarch of conservatism to the greatest practitioner of conservatism but I'd like to introduce to award it the greatest partisan of the Burkean Conservative tradition, Jessie Norman.